It's an honour to be invited to speak at this opening session of PERC, and I wish it many, many years of healthy activity and many years of troublemaking, which is the only, let's face it, the only useful rationale for institutions like this. I better begin with an obvious disclaimer, confession. This is not all my own work. As we said at the beginning, I work as part of a, well, variously called research group, or if you prefer, collective at Manchester. We, for many years, worked inside an interdisciplinary research centre funded by the ESRC called CRESC. And when the money ran out, like any other group of dodgy operators, we reinvented ourselves as Manchester Capitalism. And some of the members of the collective are just name-checked there. How do I get? I'm not a math person.
Just page down, shall we?
Oh, right.
You
Thank you. Right. So, as I've implied, this is a kind of synthesis of collective work done by a kind of changing team of duckers and divers. And there are three key sources that I'll draw on. I'm sort of embarrassed to do this kind of advertising, but I am Manchester Collective's vicar on earth for today, so I will do it. The first is the book After the Great Complacence, Financial Crisis and the Politics of Reform. The title is an obvious kind of take on the great stability. And that book basically reflected on the consequences of the great stability, the consequences of the crisis. The End of the Experiment, which was very kindly advertised right at the beginning, appeared in 2014. And what The End of the Experiment does is trying to begin to think about the way in which a post-crisis economy might be organised. And obviously, I'll try to say something by way of clarifying what we mean when we use the language of the foundational economy. And the third source is a book that is coming out later this year. It's called What a Waste, Outsourcing and How It Goes Wrong. You can see that there are some aging rockers in this collective. And the point of What a Waste is to examine the kind of political economy that was created out of the end of the experiment, the end of the great 30-year experiment. I'll say something about that in a moment. The great 30-year experiment that characterized the government of the British economy from 1979. So that's what's going on. So I wanted to start by trying to think about possible answers to John's conference question. Is there an alternative to financialization? And two very common answers are summarized there. There's an answer that really dominated economic policy for 30 years after 1979, and of course it's the famous DINA. There is no alternative to financialization. Now, the great crisis of 2008-9 obviously cast some doubt on the viability of what had been going on for the previous 30 years, and I'll talk about some of the difficulties with that in a moment. But it's also the case that even after the great crisis, there's still a very common answer to the question, and it still amounts to the argument that there isn't an alternative. This is a quotation from Boris Johnson's appropriately Thatcher lecture in 2013. The free economy is the only show in town. The free economy is the only show in town. There is no alternative because there's no alternative in the kind of world in which we now live to carnivorous capitalism. That's the second answer. And here's a third answer, and this is the answer we've been trying to develop, particularly in the foundational economy book. Let me put it in Johnsonian terms first. There is more than one show in town. The only kind of capitalism available is not carnivorous capitalism. Indeed, I'll talk about a different kind in a few minutes, herbivorous capitalism. The analytical starting point for that is a remark of Brodell's, and I've just put it there. There aren't one but several economies. There aren't one but several economies. And then also, quite important to the way in which the argument about the importance of a thing called a foundational economy develops, Everyday life consists of little things one hardly notices in space and time. Now, to get on with this argument, one's got to begin by reflecting on what I called the 30-year experiment did. I do this pretty quickly because especially an audience like this will be familiar to the point of tedium with the history of economic policy after the first Thatcher victory of 79. And we saw four things. We saw a new sale of monopolies. I mean, a sale of monopolies on a scale that dwarfs the sale of monopolies that characterised the original sale of monopolies in Stuart England. Mass privatisation as a prelude to the franchising of a whole series of mundane, you begin to, I hope, see where the argument about foundationalism is leading, to the franchising of a whole series of mundane activities. I mean, the British economy led the world in privatisation, if in nothing else, in the 1980s and 1990s. It privatised on a scale unmatched by any other leading capitalist economy, indeed exceeded probably only by the New Zealand economy. And New Zealand is very good at lots of things, rugby. So the new sale of monopolies occurred especially in the 80s and in the 90s, and was succeeded by, the time frame is a little bit mixed up, was succeeded by the franchising of a whole series of mundane activities, of energy, water, transport, all the kinds of things with which we're familiar, and I'll talk about in a moment about some of the financial consequences of that. So we got a new sale of monopolies. And the fact that it's a sale of monopolies turns out to be quite important in the bit of our argument which suggests a possible reconfiguration of economic policy. It involved, and I'll just say this in a sentence because everybody's familiar with it to the point of tedium, a reconfiguration of labour markets to increase resource and power inequalities. It involved, in the British case, the transformation of manufacturing into a network of branch operations for foreign multinationals. And I'll talk about some of the consequences of that for the economy in a moment. And finally, it involved, of course, the Wimbledonisation of the City of London, a very ugly word for a very ugly thing.
Why is it ugly? I like tennis.
An Australian would like the Wimbledon effect. If you're not a tennis fan, the Wimbledon effect runs as follows. The British stage Wimbledon, the English stage Wimbledon.
Somebody else wins it. But
somebody else always wins it. And we know that after the Big Bang in 1986, that's what happened to financial markets in London. We did indeed, and you sketched some of it, we did indeed open it up. We did become a great arena, where a financial Wimbledon took place perpetually. But the key actors weren't British.
Good point.
The key winners weren't British. You'll notice the elision. I switched from British to English because I suddenly remembered
the Scotsman won it.
The Scotsman who won it. That's right. So that's as you might say alehouse stuff. We're all pretty familiar with that. Now here, and this summarises basically material that's both in After the Great Complacence and in this. Incidentally, there are some free copies. To read, I'm quite shameless. There are some free copies of this book that I brought down, so anybody who wants to steal one is welcome to afterwards. So this is the verdict on the 30-year experiment. The experiment was, of course, intended to halt Britain's relative economic decline, to respond to the great crisis of the economy and of government that marked Britain in the 1970s. It didn't halt that relative economic decline. It left the economy by the time it all ended in tears in 2009, with what, in summary terms, we call a series of deficits. It left it with a competitiveness deficit. Productivity and investment continued to lag. Branch manufacturing, the transformation of things like the car industry into branch manufacturing, obviously failed to solve the trade deficit. We briefly talked about the problem of the trade deficit this morning. We lost about 4 million jobs in the period in manufacturing. And financial services, which were supposed to be the goose that would lay the golden egg, that would create the jobs to replace the manufacturing, Financial services probably created about around about 300,000 jobs to compensate for that. Secondly, it created a sustainability deficit. The post-war settlement, which came to grief, obviously, by the end of the 1970s, the post-war settlement, we know, delivered generous public goods. We know that there were problems with its continuing capacity to deliver generous public goods. But the series of studies that we did in CRESC on, for instance, broadband, and especially on rail, and I'll come back later to the great train robbery, show that the privatized system simply isn't delivering a sustainable infrastructure. There's a networked infrastructure black hole. Thirdly, it created an accountability deficit. It's important to cast your mind back to the kind of, not economic, but constitutional arguments that were reduced at the end of the 1970s to legitimize the terms of the Great Experiment. And an absolutely critical form of that argument was that a different kind of economy in which you privatized large parts of economic activity and shrank the size of the state would also be an economy in which it was easier to hold to account public policy makers. You know, at a kind of rhetorical level, no more backstage manipulation of nationalized industries by ministers once you've privatized them, that kind of thing. Now, the promised accountability actually never realized. In fact, what we saw was the creation of new worlds of unaccountability, out of control corporate elites, opaque franchises. I'll talk about the opaqueness of the franchises in a little bit more detail in a moment. Opaque franchises in privatization and outsourcing. Financialized accounting driven by tax, smoke and mirrors. Uncertain lines of relationship between politicians, regulators and service deliverers. Precisely the thing that privatization was supposed to sort out and throw light on. And finally, this is the period when we began to observe a really serious competence deficit. I mean, I've studied British government for over 40 years, so I'm used to the idea of fiasco. But the age of experiment, the age of a 30-year experiment, was almost uniquely a new age of fiasco. Outsourcing, PPI, rail privatization, financial regulation, you name it. We made a pig's ear of it in that period. So that's a kind of thinking aloud of a lot of the argument that went on inside the CRESC Manchester Capitalism Group, and got into things like the books like the After the Great Complacence, and also into the end of the experiment. Now, all this does is just try to put a little bit of arithmetic flesh on some of that argument. These are two attempts at a summary of the macro picture as we went through the period of the Great Experiment. So this I suspect will be familiar also to many people in this room, and I won't spend too long on it. But it's trends in UK private sector and public sector employment. Exactly for the period of the 30-year experiment, almost exactly, 1979 to 2010. Now remember, the background to it was that not only was the City of London supposed to be the goose that would lay the golden egg, but that this would involve a fundamental rebalancing of the economy in which you displace incompetent and inefficient public employment with competent and inefficient private employment, and you can just see what happens to the trend. In fact, private employment more or less flatlines over the period. The next, since I went to the business school, I've learned to use this kind of language. The next exhibit is, I'll try to take a little bit more time over, because it's absolutely critical to the argument. In some ways, it's the exhibit which summarizes the core argument in here. And I think maybe the best way to do it is to just draw your attention to the line, 1, 2, 3 lines down, that says mundane activities. What do we mean by mundane activities? Well, by mundane activities, we mean some of the things I've already flagged. The activities that provide the very foundation of civilized life. The activities that ensure that when you put the switch on, the light goes on. The activities that ensure that clean water is delivered to them. All those kinds of things. But also activities like education. Also activities like healthcare. Also activities like social care. And what we've done in the book is try to anatomize these and then do the counting. And what we get is a position. You can see we've done it for the three countries, and you can see that the three countries differ in. It's not my main interest today, but you can see that they differ quite interestingly. The absolutely critical bit of the foundational economy argument is that this is the foundational economy. If these kinds of things don't happen, then you don't have civilized economic life. You don't have civilized life. Children don't get educated. Public health isn't maintained. The lights don't go on when you want them to go on. And you can see that as far as employment is concerned, it accounts for, it depends on what country you're looking at, but in England, the biggest part of it, it accounts for about a third of total employment. Now the characteristics, this is where the little sentence from Brodel becomes rather important. The characteristics of this foundational economy, the characteristics of these mundane activities, the economic circumstances, the competitive circumstances in which they're delivered, are actually rather different from the characteristics of the kind of carnivorous capitalism that Johnson is talking about when he says there's only one show in town. This is what I mean by saying that there's more than one show in town. There is carnivorous capitalism, but there is also this. What's very striking about this, and this is the point of the next slide, this is just illustrative, is that this capitalism is not carnivorous, it's herbivorous. In other words, the great sale of monopolies, the privatization in particular of a whole series of utilities that are absolutely critical to the foundation of economic life, also opens opportunities. This is one of the big themes of What a Waste, the book that's coming out shortly. Also opens out huge opportunities for as I put it there, mundane outsourcing contracts. Now this is just crudely for the purposes of illustration, but here's what it does, obviously. It looks at, for selected dates, the pre-tax return on capital employed for a variety of contracts and activities. And as a kind of crude comparator, on the right-hand side of the bar chart, on the furthest right, we've got supermarkets. So it ain't a bad rate of return on capital employed, but it's obviously comparatively modest, and there are some rather obvious structural reasons for that. Supermarkets actually have to have a lot of capital. They have to have all those bloody vans that whiz around the country, and they have to have all the stores and so on. But then look at the other four contracts. These are characteristic results of the great sale of monopolies, and they're contracts that are at the centre of what we call the foundational economy. You can see that the star turn here is the train operating companies. That figure is derived from our 2013 report called The Great Train Robbery. 2013, you won't know this, 2013 was the 50th anniversary of a real great train robbery in 1963, so we seized on that. Basically what we're observing here is herbivorous capitalists like Branson quietly grazing on the public sector through these mundane contracts. And then the other three are just for illustrative purposes. Serco NPL management is what I think is called a GOCO contract. NPL is the National Physical Laboratory. It's pretty esoteric, but actually it's central to scientific and technical activities in a modern state. It was founded as a public institution in 1906, and it's the institution which, for instance, decides what are standards for units of measurement, those kinds of things. G4S, that's one of the big outsourcing companies. G4S, Forensic and Medical Services, is a collection of contracts, partly with health authorities and partly with police authorities. And the one on the far left, Capita Service Birmingham, is there partly because this is one of the real growth areas in franchising in the foundational economy. This is a set of contracts with Birmingham City Council that involves things like administering the IT services, that kind of stuff. And we've just selected Birmingham, but it's proliferating now throughout the whole local authority system. Now, what you can see here, and if you just take the relatively successful example of supermarkets as a comparator, what you can see here is some really luscious activity for these herbivorous capitalists. This is a world away from. It's the only show in town where if we don't act in a carnivorous way, the Japanese or the Germans will eat us up. These are classic example, of course, is train operating. These are state-sanctioned monopolies. Taking a long time, Jana, to get to answering your question, but I'm just about at it. Right. What's to be done? Okay. So here's two very reasonable starting points. I mean, we make trouble in Manchester capitalism, but we're actually very conservative. And just look at the second quotation there. That's from the great Adolf Berle, public lecture in 1962. Business exists and derives its right to exist under a tacit social contract. This social contract requires business to assume certain responsibilities. Now, plainly, if we just go back, business is operating on the very special kinds of contracts here. So, part of our starting point is that since business operates under a tacit social contract, it does indeed have to recognize its responsibilities. That's a very mild way of putting it. A slightly more aggressive and offensive way of putting it is in the first quotation. It's, of course, from a famous speech in 1885 by the great radical industrialist and eventually conservative politician, Joseph Chamberlain. I won't read the whole thing out. I'll just assume that you're able to read. But just direct you to the last sentence. What ransom will property pay for the security which it enjoys? What ransom will property pay? So our question about business in 2015 is, what ransom is business prepared to pay in order to enjoy these kinds of conditions? So that's why there's another game in town. That's why we focus on this foundational economy. Bracketing pipe and cable utilities, transport. We go beyond utilities into the retail and food processing sector. We know, for instance, that planning regulations give protection to individual supermarkets from competition, all those kinds of things. We go into health, education, and welfare. Now, these mundane goods and services are obviously necessary to everyday life, and they're consumed by all citizens regardless of income, distributed according to population through branches and networks. Typically, especially after the great sale of monopolies, they're sheltered from competition, and often they're explicitly politically franchised, as in the case of the train operating companies. The sector is large and strategic. It employs about a third of the workforce. We saw some of the figures before. And it accounts probably for about 30% of the average household's consumption expenditure. That's why, obviously, energy bills in particular are such a source of pain, for most families. So this is the other game that there is in town. In this game, business is indeed operating under very favourable conditions. It's grazing, as I say, to its heart's content in important parts of the economy. And our simple question is to businesses, what ransom are you prepared to pay for this? So then, because I don't want to offend the powerful and the rich, we forget the language of ransom, and we just say, here's the political principle. Business needs to be socially licensed against the culture of the 30-year experiment, where the notion was that we needed business-friendly government, national deregulation, all those kinds of things. We go back to the future. We go back to ideas that were important in the 1930s. No accident that Berle in 1962 was talking about the license. All business exists under a social contract of responsibility in return for its privileges, which, as I think I've shown, are very substantial in the case of the financial economy. The privileges businesses are often effectively local monopolies. That's a common feature, for instance, of a big supermarket in a small community. They drain the household spend of an immobile population. So a social license is partly designed, and we've begun to do some work with some local authorities, particularly with Enfield in London, to see if this can be cash. It's partly designed to enforce community obligations, to ensure that councils pay living wage, supermarkets attend to local sourcing. Now, all that is, at one level, I think, straightforward. What ransom is business prepared to pay? But to get to the point where business is convinced that it has to pay the ransom, there have to be plainly some pretty big political changes. And that's where, I guess, part of the argument starts to become utopian. There has to be decentralization, administrative and political. There has to be a powerful system of regional government. There are signs, particularly in Wales, that kind of devolution is indeed opening up possibilities of saying to business, what ransom are you prepared to pay? There has to be a greatly enlarged role for local government in the most centralized system of local government financing in Western Europe. And there has to be another great experiment to succeed the disastrous one after 1979, a series of experiments in economic and political life. That's it. Thank you.